Hey everybody, Chef Payne and I are back in the lab. We wanted to mix up some preferments, commercially yeasted preferments for you all. I couldn't find a good video to post, so we're here doing it for you. I want you to see the difference in these preferments. These are the commercially yeasted preferments, not wild yeasted preferments. The three main commercially yeasted preferments that are used in bake shops all across the world: pouliche, biga, and Preferments. So we're gonna mix up the pouliche first. From your reading, you might remember that a pouliche is equal parts flour to water. Chef Payne and I have temped out this water. It's about 80 degrees, and I'm going to start always with the water in my bowl. It gets a little instant yeast, super easy. And then the flour goes in the bowl, and I'm going to mix it with a spatula. It's like a stiff pancake batter. Okay, so pouliche comes from Poland, equal parts water to flour, so 100% in baker's terms, it's flour and water with a small percentage yeast. Once this is mixed completely, I'll wrap this, and this will sit covered at room temperature overnight. And we'll be letting it ferment while we're away. And when we come back, we'll use this to mix up many different types of doughs. Our focaccia and our ciabatta are both made with this pouliche, as well as our bagels and some baguettes, but lots and lots of uses for this. So the thing about this type of a preferment that's loose, it has a shorter window of ripeness. So it's ideal because it's easy to mix up, but you've got to work when it's telling you it's ready. And you know it's ripe when it's reached its full capacity and it just starts to fall back on itself. So we'll take a shot of that when it looks ripe, and we'll get back to you on that one. So that's pouliche. Pouliche. It is a loose, commercially yeasted preferment. All right, the next one is biga. Biga is a stiff preferment, commercially yeasted. This has about 50 to 60% water in relationship to the flour. So we've got our temped water. I'm going to add my yeast because yeast is very, very important to get the water first, as you all may remember from our Collaborate lessons and every time I talk about yeast and mixing dough. So yeast gets the water first, and then flour on top. And this one I'm gonna mix by hand because it has the texture more of a dough, a typical bread dough, just like Preferments. So these three commercially yeasted preferments, all a little different, but in the end play the same functions. They're gonna add to leavening, they're gonna increase our dough manageability because some gluten has been developed. It's had some time to build up some acids, an acidic profile, so the shelf life is a little longer with doughs that have been incorporated with a preferment. So overall fermentation, once the final dough is mixed, is shortened. There's just a whole bunch of wonderful benefits, health benefits too, when you're adding a little bit more of an acetic nature to your dough. So I'm just taking a little time to get this kneaded. Now, the biga, stiff preferment, commercially yeasted preferment, this will sit at room temperature for a couple of hours, and then I'm gonna move it to the refrigerator overnight. The stiff preferments have a wider window, a larger window of ripeness, so they make it easier for a baker to use it. This could be used in the next 2 days. Same with the Preferments. So here's my biga dough. You don't really have to develop gluten, bada bam, done. Okay, so that's pouliche and biga, and I want to move over here to Preferments. The difference between Preferments and the other two is that Preferments contains salt. So you can make bread dough, you can make a loaf from Preferments. Preferments means fermented dough or scrap dough or old dough, but not to be confused with old dough that's over fermented and has lost structure. So this is a really popular method of producing artisan breads because you don't have to make a separate batch of dough. You could just save some of the dough from that day's bake, hold it over and add it to your next day's bake, and just perpetuate that schedule. So a lot of bakers really prefer this. So again, I've got water. I've got enough yeast to leaven this, so that yeast is about 2%. I'm gonna put my flour in next. So always water first, then yeast, flour, and finally salt. You may remember that I like to keep the salt as far away from the yeast as possible. So 2 things kill yeast: direct contact with salt and 150 degrees. So this is gonna have the same hydration as our biga that we just mixed up. And so somewhere in between 55 and 60% water to flour. And you'll learn about baker's percentages in this lesson. And once we work with them and start using them as a normal terminology, you'll really appreciate being able to understand the system of measure. It helps to describe the texture of a dough and how it'll move, and it's a common language for bakers, and it helps you convert recipes. It's really fabulous. It's similar to when you, in basic math, are calculating using conversion factors. So I've got this dough that's pretty similar to the texture of my biga, right? I'm gonna get the rest of that flour worked in so that I don't have any dry spots. You want it fully hydrated. So when we are finished mixing this, he's gonna sit out at room temperature also, give it a little chance to ferment, and then the Prefermente goes into the cooler also. So a note of mention, if you are working with a cold pre-ferment versus a room temperature pre-ferment, it's gonna change your water temperature. In this lesson, you learn about desired dough tempering also. It's a big lesson, a big week, but it's artisan, so we're really getting into our content now. When I store these, I'm going to put them into a sprayed container. I'm gonna press it down, and then he's gonna get covered. There's my Prefermente, here's my biga, and here's my pouliche. And they are going to really grow in size. The pouliche will really get big by tomorrow, so we'll be back to show you this when we've got some fermentation movement and you can see the excitement. All right, that's Preferments commercially yeasted.
Hi ladies and gentlemen, we're back today with our starters. This is our pouliche, okay? So this was a mixture of equal parts flour and water and just a little bit of yeast. Now, it's best, a pouliche works best between 16 or 18 hours, the holding time. It's about when it's gonna hit its maximum. And this one has actually been about 24 hours. And so we could tell by the markings on this container that he rose up to about here and he's fallen back down to here, which means he is past his prime. But we can still use it. It can still be the pouliche for the recipe, for instance, in the focaccia bread that we'll be making in class here. So, but that's what we're looking at with the texture and the you can see all that gas.
Why don't you reach in there, Chef Payne, and show them
For
how stretchy
sure.
it is and sticky.
Oh,
Hold it up.
look at that. Look at that.
That's nice. So
Yeah.
when I work with a real wet pre-ferment like this, I will wet my hands. So sticky, wet pre-ferments don't stick so much to wet hands. So that's a little trick we'll use when we get into lab.
Okay, so that's our pouliche. Okay, now we're here with our biga. The biga is an Italian stiff pre-ferment made with commercial yeast. This mixture is approximately 60% water, a little under 1% on our yeast. Okay, so this is the one we also mixed yesterday, and this one has been in our refrigerator for 24 hours. Bigas can be manipulated depending on when you want to use them and the percentage of the yeast that you include. So if you want to use it more quickly, you bump up the yeast a little bit. If you want it to last a little longer, you use a little less yeast. And this one could be used, you could keep it in the refrigerator and source it for the next couple of days actually. And so you can kind of see where we marked it with our tape yesterday.
And you can see those bubbles there, that CO2, fermentation occurring. Gluten is gently aligning. So this pre-ferment, like all of them, will add some structure to your final dough, some leavening, some flavor, and some shelf life.
Okay, that's our biga. Moving on, this is our pot fermente. Pot fermente translates literally as fermented dough, sometimes referred to as scrap dough. This recipe has slightly more water than the biga. It's about 65%. It has almost double the yeast, and it also has the salt. So for all intents and purposes, this is a bread dough. And that's how it is used in commercial bakery. This is simply be a portion of your bread dough from one day that you will save and use in the production for the next day. This was a method popularized by a baker, Raymond Calvel. He's very French. You may discover some information about him as you're doing your research on the Bread Bakers Guild. And he is really the father of this technique, and is probably responsible for its popularity of use in the United States now. So, this is the pot fermente. Here's our biga. And again, the pouliche. When we get into the kitchen, we're going to be using all three of these. We're going to use all three of these, produce the end product so that you get to see how the dough reacts, how it moves, how it changes, and of course you see the end product. And then perhaps you'll adopt one of these methods as your favorite when you move on into your bread baking life. Okay? So, pre-ferments.